satisfied with what is being done, and at the same time we would be very keen to listen to your presentation on the HCR-20.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you so much for coming. I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to extend my appreciation to Dr. Samar for inviting me, and also to Professor Birgit from the Life Project. And I've been so pleased by the warm hospitality of the Egyptian people. So it's been lovely to be here. I have indeed seen some antiquities, the pyramids, of course, the Sphinx. I sat on a camel.
That's the real challenge.
The real challenge. I didn't fall off on the way down. Yeah, that was good. And I think my favorite cultural experience here so far has been experiencing the traffic in Cairo. That's been quite a thrill. So I'd like to talk to you about structured assessment of risk for violence and the management of violence risk. This is a topic I've cared about for a long time and have been working on for close to 25 years. So I'll talk about common legal and clinical applications. I realize very much that we're in a forensic psychiatric setting right now. We're talking about forensic psychiatry, but risk assessment is relevant in other settings as well. A brief history of the field of risk assessment, the goals of risk assessment, what are we trying to accomplish. I'll introduce very briefly this model of violence risk assessment called structured professional judgment. And one exemplar of that model is the HCR-20, which stands for Historical Clinical Risk Management, and there's 20 risk factors. Historical, past risk factors, clinical, more current, recent risk factors, and the risk management scale has to do with future concerns. I'll talk briefly about research support for the HCR-20. There's a lot of talk about research and the Life Project and the work that will come out of that, so I'll give a little nutshell summary of the research support for the HCR-20 and relevance in Egypt and beyond, in the Arabic-speaking world. So common applications, you can see forensic there, the second on the left. This is also used by private practitioners in different countries in the world who get, say, hired by the courts or lawyers to inform the court. It's used in corrections, so a lot of prison services in different parts of the world. It's used in general psychiatry as well, civil psychiatric, general mental health. The police also use it in different parts of the world to help manage cases. So those are some of the settings in which it's used, and then on the right-hand side you can see what it's used for. So it's often used to manage risk over time, to make admission decisions if somebody's coming into a forensic hospital, for example, to monitor them while they're in the forensic hospital, to plan for discharge, and then for community functioning and to monitor them in the community after discharge. So a brief history of risk assessment. Johnny Backstrom and Henry Stedman. Johnny Backstrom was a mentally disordered offender in the United States. Henry Stedman, a sociologist. Johnny Backstrom was subject to a law in the US, in New York State at the time, called the dangerous mentally disordered accused. If you had a mental disorder and you were convicted of certain violent crimes, after your prison sentence, you could be declared a dangerous mentally disordered accused because you were considered to be high risk for violence, and you can be detained indeterminately for a length, unspecified length. Johnny Backstrom didn't like that, so he appealed all the way up to the US Supreme Court and said, my rights are being violated on the grounds of mental disorder. You can't do this to me just because I have a mental disorder. So he won, and the US Supreme Court said Johnny Backstrom and 966 other people in his situation need to be discharged or transferred to less secure facilities like civil psychiatric facilities. So all of these people had been predicted to be violent. That's why they were detained. Hank Stedman, who's still active in the field 50 years later, followed these patients up. 7% had another violent conviction. 7 out of 7%, of 967 people. So a vast, vast over-prediction, inaccurate prediction of violence. John Monahan summarized in 1981 5 different studies. That's all there really was in 1981 on risk assessment, and declared that we were inaccurate 2 out of 3 times we made some statement of future violence risk. So the early research was not promising. There were a handful of risk assessment instruments in the early 1990s. I would argue today there's too many. People keep developing new instruments. There's hundreds of risk assessment instruments. Many of these are what we call homegrown. They're used, say, just in the Ohio Department of Corrections or the Florida Department of Corrections. The HCR-20 was first published in 1995, but in 1998 there was the first publication on it. So in just under 20 years, you'll see where the state of the research is now. There's over 300 disseminations of publications, dissertations, and so forth. I'd say there's about 450 studies in general of structured professional judgment, and probably about 800, maybe even to 1,000 studies on risk assessment more broadly. What do we want to do with risk assessment? What is the purpose and the point? We need to identify who is higher and who is lower risk. That's one of the core elements to it. Who poses a greater risk if they were, say, discharged from one of your forensic hospitals into the community? We want to prevent violence. We always say we want to, for the patients, we want to help them be happy and healthy, or move them along a path toward being happier and healthier, and that includes not hurting other people. Risk assessment systems should also include an emphasis on accountability for us. So it's important that our decisions are transparent, fair, and reviewable, so that a judge or a court can see how we reached our decision. That's fair for patients. We want to protect patients' rights so that they're not detained arbitrarily. But we also, and this may not be as much of an issue in Egypt, but in some parts of the world, like the United States, there's a lot of lawyers, and they like to sue people, including psychiatrists. So we want a system that is evidence-based, because that helps protect our own liability. So the end goal is the prevention of violence, hopefully no violence, but at least the mitigation of violence. To get there, we need to understand why people are violent, and we need to manage and treat. The first step, though, is to try to identify and forecast who is higher and lower risk, and upon what grounds. There's been over the years a few different methods of risk assessment, so general approaches. The first, I'd say, is one that's completely discretionary. There's no real guidance. Some people in the field have called this unstructured clinical judgment. Of course, clinical judgment is a valuable and positive necessity in a risk assessment, but within some level of structure, it can be very helpful. Structured professional judgment, I would say, allows for an optimal amount of discretion. It's semi-structured, so the professional can still exercise some judgment. Actuarial approaches, I would argue, give no discretion to the professional. They kind of prejudge what the important risk factors will be, kind of regardless of the case specifics. So they're over-structured. Structured professional judgment relies on guidelines to help structure your judgments about violence risk. It guides prevention through planning, reflects best practice, it specifies basic risk factors, which we'll get to, but it doesn't restrict your scope. So if there's other risk factors that you think are important in a given case, you can consider those. There's no algorithms used, so you don't have to do calculations, mathematical calculations to come up with a risk estimate, but there definitely are coding rules and structure around how to come to decisions. Finally, it's intended to be good for monitoring change. This is really important. Is somebody getting worse? Do we need to change our risk management plan? Are they doing better so we can maybe reduce the intensity of supervision? We really value reliability and validity. There's been a lot of research on this approach. Structured professional judgment, as I mentioned, can be applied broadly in different fields: forensic, general psychiatry, prison. It's intended to be a comprehensive risk assessment to get a good, thorough understanding of why somebody poses a risk for violence. Informs management, treatment, and prevention. It's semi-structured, optimally structured, so it tries to draw on the strengths of both clinical judgment approaches, pure clinical judgment approaches, as well as some of the benefits of an actuarial approach, such as transparency and structure. It's evidence-based, and it's geared toward standardizing evaluations, recognizing that there are variations in the challenges based on different settings. So you may have, in some settings, more time to do an evaluation, in other settings, less time. You might be working in the community, you might be working within a hospital. The HCR-20 itself is a 130-page long professional manual. The translators were really happy to find that out, 130 pages. It also comes with rating and worksheets. So there's structured worksheets for you to be recording which risk factors are present and your ideas about management and so forth. It's geared to answer 3 basic questions. Why has the person done what he or she has done in terms of violence? What are you worried that this person might do in the future? And what are you going to do about it to try to prevent that harm? 3 basic questions. Those questions, we then, in the manual, help the